Welcome to the AgEmerge Podcast, brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. Your farming challenges are unique, so your practices should be too. We're here to share emerging ideas, build connections, and provoke conversation.
Get ready to improve your soil, your crops, your livestock, and your family's livelihood. I'm your producer, Kim Chase.
And I'm your host, Monte. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the podcast. Before we get started with this episode, we wanted to let you know that there is still time to register for the AgEmerge Summer Summit. You're invited to join us August 4th and 5th for a 2-day field event where you'll experience soil health and regenerative agriculture in action on the Bottens family farm in Cambridge, Illinois. In addition to learning from Monte, you'll hear from experts in their field, including Dr. Joel Groover and Megan Filbert, along with some thought-provoking and motivational stories shared by farmer and mentor Cameron Mills and retired mixed martial artist and UFC Hall of Famer Pat Miletich. We'll cover a lot of ground, from the basics of cover cropping to the wild side of livestock integration. So come enjoy a chance to think outside the box and get your questions answered as we share years of experience in a full transparency farm tour. Oh, and we won't let you go hungry. All meals during the event are included with registration, and we'll also keep you entertained as you'll have a unique opportunity to spend a fun evening in the pasture with dinner and live music at the 4th annual Concert with the Cows. This is an event you won't want to miss. For more information and to get registered, head on over to our website at www.asn.farm. And now, on to our show. Thanks for joining us. Today we welcome Eric Jackson and Dr. Stephan Van Vliet. Eric currently serves as the board chair of the Bionutrient Association. And since we last spoke with Dr. Van Vliet, he has joined the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University. You'll want to check out the show notes for their full bios. Eric and Stephan talk with Monte about how they are working together to explore nutrient density and food production from the soil up. Eric stated it best when he said it became apparent to him that there is a path forward if we want to create a food system that gives an opportunity for growers to participate in the value that they create through their production practices around quality. And there's a lot packed into this conversation, so let's jump right in.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the AgEmerge Podcast. I'm really blessed to be joined by two great individuals today. And we'll see how this works with technology and everything. I'm pretty excited about it. First off, we got Dr. Stephan Van Vliet. Many of you know him from previous podcasts that we did on tying the whole soil health to human nutrition. It was pretty popular, a lot of listens, and people had a lot of questions about it. So we're happy to have him back. And today we're also joined with Eric Jackson. I'm pleased to have him here. He's got a wide, diverse background in food and nutrition. And I'm just going to give a little time for each of you to kind of tell your background stories and what brings you to this intersection of soil health and human nutrition. So Eric, if we could, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity here. My entire career was spent building supply chains in agriculture. And, I came up sort of through the classic channels of more is better. And we really focused a lot on quantity, both at the crop production level as well as in the processing and handling and shipping level. About 17 years ago, I don't know exactly, what got into something I ate, but I decided that probably the next path forward would have to be around the qualitative attributes of food rather than just the quantitative attributes. You can't do either one exclusively, but I think again, based on my experience, we really had not spent any time talking about quality other than the basic grain assays and protein, fat, and moisture and things like that. So it was fast forward until 2019 when I met Dan Kittredge at Bionutrient Food Association, and we struck up a conversation. We actually did some work, testing the nutrient density of wheat and oats in 2020. But it became apparent to me that there is a path forward. If we want to create a food system that gives an opportunity for growers to participate in a value that they create through their production practices around quality, we can do some upfront work to sort of prove out the model And then modeling, I believe, can take it forward. I mean, Stefan, you and I haven't talked about this too much, but clearly we're not going to eventually test every single cut of meat, for example. But I think we're going to find out some truisms through this research that will allow us to create these models and give consumers an option, right? And once we can give consumers an option, we're pretty confident that the market will take it from there. So the Bionutrient Food Association has been doing work for about the last 10 years to determine, first and foremost, is the variability in the nutrient composition of food significant? Because if it's not terribly significant, then who cares, right? And what is significance? Well, we didn't know when we got started doing this work what exactly we were looking for. In our wildest dreams, we thought maybe a 50% differential or something like that. And what we've come up with in our research over the last several years across a wide variety of crops is we see orders of magnitude of difference in terms of nutrient content. 10, 20, 50, 100 to an extreme 200 times the level of certain nutrients in various crops that if you look at them visibly, they look quite similar. And so armed with that information, we consider that to be non-controversial at this point. The variability exists. So now obviously the key question is why, right? And so that's what we're working on going forward. And it's all with an eye towards being able to create a marketplace that values quality, at the consumer level.
So by the modeling aspect that you're looking at, Eric, you're saying that we got anywhere from 10x to 200x nutrient density difference, depending on what that component is. So now we're going to try and find out what is driving that. So by the model, are you hoping then that you can input the various drivers, whether it's a production practice, a variety selection, a geographic location, a soil test quantities, that then you can essentially predict that this is going to have, a 5x outcome, or this set of conditions will have a 200x outcome? Is that what you're hoping to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Stefan obviously talk about the scientific process, but I think in general, you're spot on. In general, once we understand what set of conditions creates what set of outcomes, and we can do that reliably and repeatedly, then we can start to use a model to demonstrate that. Obviously, you'll be doing ground truthing, on occasion to make sure your model's working. But the point is really not to get down to the nth degree. The point is to create a green, yellow, red type scheme that's easy for consumers to understand, right? And that you have confidence in the presentation, because we've done the research up front that we're embarking on with Stefan in the case of beef and with other parties in other crops, right?
Excellent. Well, I mean, when you're dealing with chemistry or you're dealing with mechanics, input A equals output B. Many times that's really easy. So now, Dr. Van Vliet, we're in the biology world here. So there's a lot of unknowns in how all these interactions happening. Eric describes it very succinctly, very well, what we want to accomplish. But I noticed he threw that back onto you there real quick, that you're the guy that has to figure this out. So we're both sitting here waiting. Tell us exactly how daunting of a process is this, and how do you, is there hope to be able to accomplish these things?
Yeah, no, well, I'm happy to figure it out, and it's of course very, very interesting and important work. Yes, Eric described, what we hope to see is that if we profile, let's say we profile 300 beef farms, so 300 ranchers, ranging anywhere from feedlot finish to grass-fed. But in grass-fed, there's obviously differences between rotational grazing, continuous grazing, diverse pastures, monoculture pastures, and things like that. But it's really a spectrum that we see this on. But what we hope to find, or what our hypothesis is, and what our initial pilot data would suggest, is that farmers that have certain practices in common, such as rotational grazing, leaving plenty of forage on the pastures, having ground cover on there. Those are some of the patterns that then we see emerging as, okay, these certain principles or these practices result in a phytochemically rich piece of meat or another crop or another type of eggs or milk. So whether this be in North Dakota or Florida or Mexico, right? There are certain principles that farmers seem to adhere to that results in the most nutrient dense type of foods. And how that exactly looks depends on the farmer, depends on the ecoregion, what the farmer can accomplish, right? Because there's many things that come involved with that, and you cannot always be perfect, but that is kind of what we hope to find, these certain patterns, and that we can reasonably say, because also with human nutrition work, and we're not going to feed 300 types of beef to someone. That will be a very long trial. But if we can say, okay, yeah, it will be every day. That's right.
I'll help, no problem.
But if we say, okay, this piece of beef that was grown in this way falls in this percentile of nutrient density. So, and we see these health outcomes in people, then it's safe to say that other pieces of beef that fall roughly on the same sliding scale of nutrient density would be expected to have similar outcomes. So that is a way of we try to figure out the importance of nutrient density, because as Eric described, we see these 10-fold, 100-fold differences in certain nutrients. Now, I must say it's not as dramatic in beef, but we still see substantial differences. The next question is then, does this have an appreciable health effect? Something can look healthier on paper, but is the actual effect something we can pick up in human health? And can we make a difference for the health of the population?
So I think you, since the last time we discussed, you were doing some research in regards to tracking the soil, the animal, and all the secondary metabolites, and then in looking at blood samples and such with humans. I know that was one of the things you were doing, but you've also done some recent research that just was released. You want to update us a little bit on what that was and how that leads into this soil to human connection.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've done additional profiling of. We started really at the soil, and one interesting that we noticed is we went to various grass-fed beef farms. We took soil there. We took forage samples from there. And then we found the nearest monoculture cornfield, and we took soil samples from there too. So in the same ecoregion, oftentimes these were just a mile apart. And those would actually serve as sort of the monoculture corn. A lot of it will go into the commodity market, might end up in feedlots. So that's the model, sort of the conventional feedlot finished model. Right. So we took those corn samples, we took those pasture samples. And it was kind of interesting because some of the research team that was there already said, well, Stefan, we can just look at these samples and we see there's a difference. But we also tested them, and indeed there was obviously a difference. We found 2 to 3% higher soil organic matter in the pastures compared to the corn, the monoculture cornfields. We also found more minerals, higher total exchange capacity, so the ability of the plants to soak up nutrients. And it really gets after the question is that, okay, if we use these for well-managed animals, for well-managed grazing, does this have an impact on soil health? Well, we found that typically the soil is healthier if we have actual animals graze it rather than, growing commodity crops that maybe then go into animal agriculture later. Then this relationship we also see translating through is where, okay, this improved soil health results in more phytochemicals in the plants, right? Because the plant has to get its nutrients from somewhere. And it's maybe an oversimplification because there's a symbiotic relationship between the plants and the soil. But okay, more nutrient-rich soils equals more phytochemically rich plants. And then we see this translation or this carryover towards the meat, where the animal, if they're grazing more phytochemically rich plants, then we see these secondary metabolites appear in animal source foods. And these, depending on some individual compounds, they may be 10 or 20-fold higher, but on average, they're about 3-fold higher, these phytochemicals. So these are antioxidants, polyphenols, terpenes, and other compounds that have potentially anti-inflammatory effects. And at least in cell models or in vitro models or animal models, as I'm talking here about lab rats, they may have certain anti-diabetic or anti-cancer effects. Now, we don't know. I'm not saying that grass-fed beef lowers your risk of cancer, but okay, on paper, there are compounds in that could potentially have these health effects. And that's the next thing we're trying to find out.
Well, that's fascinating. And one of the things you said early on, Eric, was about 17 years ago. And that very much ahead of trend. Being in the commodity business, like you said, it's all about, pounds, tons, bushels, consistency. But seeing that 17 years ago, we really need to have this focus on quality. How does that supply chain change? How do we make that happen? And you also mentioned Kittredge too, and he has a real emphasis on local. Okay, and I think what you were talking about, Stefan, there on across the road pasture versus the commodity grain field, that's key. But I think there's some emerging research on epigenetics. If you eat food that your body's adapted to the region that you live in and the food that grows there, how do we take this amazing system? Well, we thought it was amazing, I guess, of commodities that you just can handle billions of tons of product efficiently and just reverse engineer it back to 100, 150 years ago. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in the phrase I use is crawl, walk, run. This isn't about a sudden replacement of anything that currently exists. This is first and foremost about understanding what the possibilities are. The other component about local and regional food systems that's also true is in and of itself that leads to healthier foods simply because of the distance between production and consumption, right? Now, bananas we're not going to grow in the Midwest, but a lot of things that are grown in California, for example, can be easily grown in the Midwest on a seasonal basis. And you might add 10 days of shelf life to that product simply by having it grown more locally. I think there seems to be a significant push. The timing seems right currently. There seems to be a significant push to re-examine all aspects of the food supply chain. I think COVID, broke a few things that we didn't think would ever break. The USDA certainly came out again last week in force and announced a whole bunch of programs that have, relationships to regional and local production systems. So I can imagine a dual system. One is focused on food, one is focused on industrial ingredients, right? And the industrial ingredients could include food and might very well include food, but the food system itself, which is not what the predominance of acres goes towards right now in the US, right? Most of it's industrial ingredients for other processes. Mm-hmm. So if the food system is qualitative and the industrial system is quantitative, I think that's okay, right? I'm not suggesting that we're gonna ship unit trains of beef from one place to another, in pursuit of this better food system. But I do think that there's room for both, and I do think that there's a mentality right now in agriculture, and particularly in the youth in agriculture, to try to re-examine some of the things that maybe we have forgotten, maybe we have, given up in terms of our pursuit of high quantities of stuff. So, but you need, you can be very, sort of blue sky about this on the one hand. On the other hand, scientific backing becomes very important, because once you've proven something, or once you've indicated something over and over and over again, you can hang a lot of things around that from a supply chain standpoint. And I've never met a farmer, and I know thousands of them, literally. I've never met a farmer that, given the opportunity to participate in creating value on a consistent basis, won't put up their hand and say, I'm really curious about that. At the very least, I'd like to understand it, right? But we need to be able to create that system, create that value proposition, and show that that is indeed available to them to participate in. And I think we will get participants at the production level. A lot of it will be more regional and more local, but I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think we will continue to run an industrial sector as well.
We're taking a short break to share that the AgEmerge podcast is brought to you by the team at Ag Solutions Network. Rooted in innovation, ASN is committed to leaving the land better than we found it, not simply maintaining it. We're here to help you navigate the balancing act of productivity and building a legacy. From practices to products, ASN is more than a new jug. It's a new way of thinking. So don't be afraid to be different. Be afraid to be the same. Contact Ag Solutions Network today at asn.farm. And now back to our show.
And I think that's really interesting, just looking at separating those out a little bit. I think a great example of that and the value added that farmers chased after is the almond. And the Almond Board of California has done an amazing job of doing the research, right, over and over and over again of how healthy an almond is, right? They did that early on. And then they've kind of scaled back on their research a little bit. They've kind of gone into research on defending mode as far as pollinators and water consumption and those kind of things. But that core nutrition information, they have leveraged that and created, 30 years ago, almonds were nobody really wanted them. They're not that great of a crop. Now it's one of the leading crops in California. And I think, like you said, too, those crops that are being grown, like almonds, you're not going to grow in Iowa. But tomatoes, there used to be tomato processing plants here, produce, all those things could migrate, and they will because of the water situation there. There's water grow half as much as what we have, period. And all of the West, really. We were talking ahead of the show about, the Great Salt Lake and its draining and those kind of things. So there's some serious things we got to happen, but there's hope because some of those industrial things that you're talking about, I was a partner, my dad was a partner in an ethanol plant, and, that was all the rage. And all of a sudden, when electric cars come on the scene, a little less need for ethanol, right? So that's one of those ingredients that's going to free up space for maybe some of those grass-fed cattle and soil improvement. So it's...
you can imagine, if I might interject, you can imagine a scenario in the not too distant future. In agriculture, it's only one swing a year. So, we're only talking 10 or 15 innings here of time. You can imagine a situation where those 40 million acres that today are dedicated to grow corn for ethanol, right? Some of those aren't needed anymore. I'm not suggesting the entire ethanol industry goes away either, right? There's a whole bioplastics opportunity, around that and conversion to other materials. But if those first acres that come out of corn production for ethanol are situated in what I call first ring zones around metropolitan areas, right? Those should be food sheds. Those areas should be food sheds and should include animal production, right? Now, you're not going to want the animals in the cities, right? But 50 miles outside of the cities, on acres, working on soil regeneration, as well as producing high quality food, even for a local market, right? So your time from harvest to consumption is really, really short, which also increases the nutrient opportunity for the crop. I mean, all of that it would have sounded phantasmagorical 10 years ago. I believe that's actually where we are heading. And I think if we are planful about it, and it's backed up by the type of science that we're doing here, if we're planful about it, we can do it in an organized fashion. And absolutely everybody enjoys the abundance from that. The growers, particularly the growers, I think will participate in the value chain at a much higher level than they do today in the industrial value chain, where they get the last piece. In this world, they get the last piece of it. The only way they can participate in ethanol is by being an owner in an ethanol plant, right? Otherwise, they get the last piece. Here, they are sitting next to the consumer in some respects, and it's not a CSA type program. There's still industrial aspects to the supply chain, but we've done our homework, and almonds actually is a great example. That's a phenomenal example of how things can move from not a well appreciated crop, let's say, and beef certainly has its challenges, right? Mm-hmm. Beef has its challenges in terms of the appreciation of what it can do for human health, much less for soil health. So I think beef is important because it's the highest monetary category in agriculture.
Yeah, and to add to that, and I agree, Eric, and I think we'll probably land somewhere in the middle between local and industrial, and there's a room for both, right? During the Green Revolution, we went like this heavily industrial model. Sort of the idea was get big or get out, right? And really squeeze the local food supply. And I feel like now we're kind of getting back to also the local part. We probably land somewhere in the middle, whereas maybe before we were all local and regional, then we went completely industrial, and we kind of want to land in the middle on a combination of the two. And to that point too, I oftentimes, and I'm sure consumers can relate to this, when you try a carrot or a strawberry from California, right, that was picked prior to peak ripeness, it kind of tastes lottery with a hint of carrot flavor or a hint of strawberry flavor. But now here, the strawberries are back in season. And if they are picked the day before and then you get them, then you have that peak flavor, right? And also that results in the most phytochemically rich and antioxidant rich strawberry. So also the nutrient density is higher because you harvest it before peak ripeness, so it doesn't have the peak phytochemical richness. And B, you also start losing that in supply chain. So it can have both sort of benefits of connecting with local food supplies again, but also getting just a little bit more nutrient-dense foods on the table of people, and doing that indeed close to an urban environment. I think is great also for the farmers to have a big market on farmers markets where they can sell some of their products directly.
Or even like Eric was referring to, you could have cities where they're, the local distributor where farmers can feed into kind of a hybrid model. So instead of having a vertically integrated shipper like Taylor Farms in California that's doing everything from planting it to packing it to distributing it, you'd have maybe the farmers participating in a cooperative or a independent distributor. And that's interesting. Those food ring idea, that makes a lot of sense. And again, it goes back to kind of reflecting the way things really were 100 years ago. In my area, we're a long ways where I farm from a large population. So we grew a lot of grains here because that was easy to ship. But, if you look at in the late 1800s, the number of dairies that surrounded Chicago, was ridiculous. Illinois was a huge dairy state at that time because they all these little dairies surrounding Chicago to feed Chicago. So that's very interesting. The other thing I'm hopeful for is I remember when I first started farming, it was consistently about 72 million acres of corn and soybeans. And all of a sudden, today it's hovering around the 90 million acres of each, right? So we brought 36 million acres into those crops. Now, yes, some came from cotton, some came from wheat, but a lot of it came from marginal areas on, I would call it the outer ring of the Corn Belt. And I think those are areas where they were struggling to be profitable in the beef cattle business. This was an opportunity with government guarantees and those kind of things, prevent plant, blah, 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 to make money. But I see as maybe that industrial need in ethanol decreases and your research with grass-fed beef increases. Now there's an opportunity for the non-local, but the kind of the in-between grass-fed national brand to exist. Do you agree with that kind of a tier? You got the ring, you've got this kind of national brand, healthier choice, and then the conventional. Is that how you see it kind of sorting out, Eric?
Well, I think one of the reasons that the beef industry has moved out of the Midwest, for example, primarily into the Southwest and other areas, A, there's land cost, B, there's population. There's obviously state by state regulations with regards to CAFOs and everything about the production system. But there was also a centralization of the packing houses, right? And they, as you know, drove where you're going to raise the animals. So it was determined by the economists, right, that this new system was going to be more efficient than the old system. And it did not take into account that these marginal acres that you talk about are only marginal for corn and soy. They're not necessarily marginal acres, right? And if taken care of, and we're talking about not intensively grazing, but if taken care of on a managed basis, some of these marginal crop lands can very easily be put to use in the production of ruminant products, right? The products that we get out of the ruminant system. So I think we'll be grazing areas that we didn't think we were going to graze again, because it makes sense economically and because it makes sense from a nutritional standpoint. And I think that, again, if you listen to the USDA's announcements over the last several months, talking specifically about the packing industry and talking specifically about the need to reintegrate the local meat systems, right? That's the perfect opportunity to be launching this kind of research. This is the first body of research I'm aware of, Stefan, where we've taken you in the medical community and us in the agricultural community and intentionally put those together to create understanding, right? And, the supply chain piece is going to be, I think, will be worked out around the value proposition that if our research to your point, our thesis, if your research supports our thesis, then I think that the market will figure this out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's also a growing market, right? The grass-fed beef market's been growing year after year. Local food systems are growing, and to your point also about the marginal lands, we have been converting marginal lands, grasslands, at about 1 million acres per year in the US over the last 15 years. And oftentimes we go into less productive lands, so the yield of corn and soybeans on those new lands are not even as productive. They reach like 70-80% level of productivity because these lands are not as suitable for growing these crops. And it comes at a high cost of wildlife, of bird populations especially. And if you could have a well integration of animals there, I think that's certainly a good point. And also the reintegration of those. And I was driving through Nebraska last year, and it was actually great to see how many cattle were grazing crop residue and obviously putting nutrients back in and improving nutrient cycling and obviously giving them feed over the winter period, right? So I maybe it's just because I'm paying more attention to it, but it's also the literature would suggest that people are thinking more about that. And even IPCC, in the latest report, the agroecological approaches integrating crops, trees, and livestock is being hailed as one of the most important strategies and the strategy we have the most research for to improve the sustainability. And we've separated those completely, right? Crop agriculture, animal agriculture, and even nature, because we think that agriculture and nature are somehow completely different entities, which it doesn't make much sense, and probably is part of the reason why we're in this mess. But reassembling those linkages is going to be so important, and I think there, oftentimes with local farmers and local food systems, it kind of naturally happens, that reintegration.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, your observation of those cattle out in Nebraska. And the reason is many of them have cow-calf operations, and they have some rangeland that they can't farm. So they're there, and then they recycle those residues. But the funny part is that happened all the time. I remember when I was a kid, real small, kindergarten or something, someone said, "Oh, those are stock cows." And I heard it as stalk cows, STALK, because I thought that's what they were. Stalk cows, they're out on corn stalks, right? So, and that was a common sight. We saw it all the time, but in our effort to get big or go home, we've taken out every fence we have, right? So that's not even an option at this moment. So, a lot of things have changed. So let's say that the thesis is proven correct and everything looks very promising now. What can farmers be doing today to be prepared for this change, to take advantage of this value add and those kind of things? What kind of feedback have you got, Stefan, from people, other farmers that you've talked to, and all the sampling that you're doing? What kind of aha moments do the farmers themselves have of what they need to do differently as a result of the work you've done?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's usually one of the things that the farmers often notice is, what we notice in our work is the importance of plant diversity. If you're able to increase the biodiversity on your pasture, you typically accumulate more nutrient-dense meat. So that's higher amounts and a wider variety of these phytochemicals. Mm-hmm. And those also have sort of offshoot targets where that is better for the soil, right? The animal health is improved. So I think that's often an aha moment for the farmer, because they see a whole multitude of things improving. But I must also admit is that I'm often learning from the farmers in this work, because the farmers see things, empirically, or they notice these things on the field. And then we take this into the lab and say, like, okay, let's verify that. Let's see if that's the case, and let's see if we can find these patterns. And those are the patterns that we find, is that especially the biodiversity piece seems to be particularly important. And I do understand it's for farmers, and oftentimes what you see at the struggle is that moving over, shifting gears, right? And usually it's a younger generation that then makes the transition and starts, doing this more in a regenerative way, or maybe older farmers that have hit rock bottom, right? And are really feeling, hard to make a living, that are making some of these changes. And in an attempt to especially cut costs on the input side. And I think that's also what sort of the aha moment is with the farmers, is that, requiring less fertilizer, requiring much less pesticides and herbicides. It's not so much that they improve their they make profit by cutting things on the cost side of things, rather than selling something for a much higher price. And I think that's really the aha moment, is that, and even sometimes they get smaller, but they are able to make more money. So I think that's so important. But it's usually something needs to happen for people to change, or there's a turnover in generation, I think.
What do you think, Eric? How do farmers be ready for or to respond to this emerging discoveries that we're having?
Well, I kind of think about the nutrition discussion as being the next step beyond the environmental discussion. So there's a lot of focus today, as you know, on getting money back to production agriculture in the form of carbon credits or water credits or biodiversity credits. Ecosystem services is broadly what we call that category of monetization, right, of benefits. And I think that again, in my dreamland, the farmers will not only benefit from that, which has become more visible. And I got to tell you, I participated 17 years ago in the Chicago Climate Exchange, and that was all la-la back then, right? Nobody knew what the heck we were talking about. But that's front and center today. The problem is I don't think the consumer is going to buy that proposition. I don't think the consumer is going to spend any more money or pay that much attention, quite frankly, strictly to the environmental proposition. So if the farmer can reap the benefit, and many growers, we all know them, are looking at this seriously, how do I participate in this ecosystem services market, and I can create a better product? That's a real winner. So I don't know that today, because we don't have all this research ready yet, I don't know that today the proposition around nutrition is the driving force. I think it's the proposition around environmental outcomes, which we believe, and again, through the pilot research that's been done by both BFA and Stefan, we believe that those outcomes are consistent with higher quality food.
Yeah.
Right. So let the environmental economic proposition carry through this transition period. And then once we have the research completed, then that proposition can come up alongside the environmental proposition and add yet one more layer of value to the producer.
So you're really looking at this qualitative focus. The quality-based food is not only going to provide the nutrient to the end consumer, but there's that ecosystem services aspect to it that is going to help offset the quantity-based agriculture at the same time. So, and like you said, that is much more mature. There's some things in place now. It's still a little bit of the Wild West. Am I getting $10? Am I getting $100? I'm on a steering committee right now. We're discussing $100 per acre premium for doing these kind of things, and the money is out there, and people want to pay their indulgences for their wrongs, right? So,
but it's around soil, right? The discussion's around soil.
Correct.
Right. And so we're tying together the soil outcomes with the food outcomes. So it's just think about it as a continuum. It's the next level of value that's created by doing the same things you're doing right now to capture the ecosystem service value.
And it cannot be too surprising that if we improve soil health, we improve plant health, that it has a trickle down effect, right? Like sometimes we're it's important that we do the research. We're also kind of kicking in an open door a little bit, because it cannot be too surprising that if the plant is more nutritious, right, that the animal is healthier then, and that animal health is connected with nutrient density, because these metabolites that are in the animal or that are in the meat, some of those serve as nutrients for us, but the animal or the plant doesn't produce them for us, of course. It produces them for their own health, right? But as a result, that produces more nutrient-dense foods, and we typically see that initial connection. And to your point, Eric, that's so important is that, and studies suggest that consumers are more willing to pay for their health than it is for the environment, because consumers think that affects them directly. Now, the environmental piece also affects them directly, but that they may not be as aware of that, of course, right? If the water usage of my avocado or almond in Chile or California is or how the beef even was raised with emissions and things like that and runoff. The environmental piece, we don't think affects us directly, even though it does affect us directly, but it's not as tangible as maybe something health or flavor for that matter, which is also very important. And probably if something doesn't taste good, no matter how healthy it is, the consumer is not going to buy it. But there is this connection between phytochemicals, which are health promoting compounds, but they also are flavor compounds. So that health and flavor are certainly connected too. So that's the good news, at least.
It's amazing how we know that, right? We should
Right.
eat what tastes good, and that's the way of that connection. It's amazing. There's some other person from Utah State that talked about that. Animals knowing what they need to eat, right? So
yeah, well,
we're kind of back to where we started.
Well, it's also animals. All species of animals can kind of figure out what they need to eat, right? Whether it be learning from their mother or intuitively. So it seems very unlikely that we are the only species that cannot figure out what they need to eat, and that we need to spend billions of dollars being told what to eat. We must also have that wisdom, because we are, sometimes I joke, it's like saying we think we're the intelligent ones, but you don't need to tell a cow or another, a lion is not going to dig up roots. Obviously, it kind of knows that it needs to hunt the gazelle, right? So. And humans have that intuitive wisdom too, I think.
So what you're saying is we're so brilliant that we created this massive industrial chemical system to create food cheaply, and we realize that it's bad. So now we need to reinvent how we did it, and we're going to do it kind of basically the way we did it before.
That's right.
But we're a real smart species, right?
Yeah, well, we make a lot of mistakes, and if you, I like reading history, and the thing you always see is that humans make the same mistake over and over and over again, and then the next generation we make the same mistake again, just perhaps in a different area. So,
hey, we're consistent and we're really good at it.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. But
let me put a quick plug in. Let me put a quick plug in for David Montgomery and Ann Bickley have a new book coming out, being released, I believe, on the 22nd of June. Yeah. What's Your Food Aid? And this is I think it's a seminal piece of work, because I don't think anybody's published in depth about this topic. They will be referencing very much the work of the Bionutrient Food Association in the early part of that book. And they recently completed a relatively small study that has, I think, Stefan, been very consistent with the work that you've been doing in terms of, so we're starting to get the word out, right? And this is the beginning phase of getting the word out. Prime time is still some ways off, right? But I can see it coming. I can feel it coming. This is going to be, I think, a wonderful opportunity for the food system to not abruptly change, but to modify at a pace that is going to quicken, because there will be a scientific background behind it.
So one of the other audiences we have that tunes into this podcast on a regular basis, in addition to farmers, is ag technologists. So, ag tech startups that are looking to, we really want to help point them in the direction of regenerative ag. Okay. Because there's so many technology companies out there like, a couple more bushels, a few less pounds of this. It's just making a broken system a little bit less broken or something like that. So there's huge opportunities here, Eric. Where do you see some of these opportunities for startup companies to get involved in this? Different look at food supply, a different look at how we're producing food, and where are some of the opportunities in that realm in your mind?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we are working on at the BFA is what we call the Bionutrient Meter, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of opportunity to create portable, low-cost tools that can be used at the farming level, throughout the supply chain, and in consumers' hands. And again, you're not looking for the micro measures. You're looking for general indicators, red, green, yellow, right? I think it's sufficient, as long as everybody understands what that means. But I think portability for tools that can then home run that data to a database that continues to refine the models, right? So that we are constantly building on this laboratory level work that we're doing in real time out in the field, So I think that any of those types of technologies have a clear future. The other thing that also comes to mind is, I'm going to call it the miniaturization of the processing system. Years ago, I was doing work overseas, and we always were endeavoring to create appropriate technologies for places in Africa or places in Asia that didn't have all the infrastructure that we had. If you think about localization and regionalization of food production, right? How do we do that economically at a smaller scale? And I believe we've come a long ways in both mechanical and electrical and other engineering disciplines to be able to put that together. I think that's another area that has a huge, huge opportunity. With a focus on the ergonomics, with a focus on safety, and with a focus on efficiency. So those are two areas that I'm excited about. The other areas that are already in existence, I think, and are being explored, are things around power generation on a remote basis, which kind of ties into these production facilities. But a lot of the things, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of incremental technology out there. There's a whole lot of money going into the food tech space, which I think is an entirely different pathway. I'm not a fan of replacing food with something else. So I wish all those folks the best, but I'm not a fan of that investment at this point in time. So I think it's about portability, and I think it's about localization.
Yeah, I just was on a conference call last night talking about essentially a processor in a box, where you can buy a group of shipping containers and put it on your farm, and it can process poultry, 200 birds an hour. So everything you need that's USDA inspected. So that small scale, like you said, if you're going to get to these local food sheds, you have to get to the local food processing in the case of animals, or even in the case of produce and such. There's washing, handling, packing that needs to happen. And that's a key point. I think, when we look at this, the future food is definitely going to be different. And I really appreciate the work that you guys are coming. So paint a picture of why this is important. What's the potential for healthcare savings, life expectancy, quality of life, ecosystem services? Let's just be a little wild, because you can always be right when you're predicting the future, as long as nobody plays this back 10 years from now, right? Stefan, describe that ideal world that you're working for when you retire, Professor Emeritus, and have all the accolades hanging on the wall. What is your contribution and your team's contribution going to look like, you think, to the world?
Well, at the end of my career, I hope to have answered the question: do more sustainable production practices also improve human health and the nutrient density of foods? Very much believe that at least initial work suggests that there's a connection between the two. And if you look at, for instance, and that's something we often don't talk about, the environmental footprint of our healthcare system. Now, I've worked in hospitals and did my postdoctoral training there. The amount of consumables we blow through, and the amount of cost that it takes to keep people sort of healthy, but we're not really addressing the root cause, right? That's one of those things. If we even bring that back, that could already be a major saver of things like greenhouse gas emissions and improving the health of people. And also the monetary savings we make from that. If we even invest like a fraction of that into improving our food supply, I think we're better off. Part of the issue is, of course, is that there is a certain degree of profitability to that, right? If doing the right thing becomes the most profitable thing, then I'll be very, very happy. And doing a sustainable thing and making that profitable, then I think we're looking very good. But as always, these are baby steps. So I must also be realistic that I can have dreams, and I hope we can move the needle a little bit in the right direction. But there's some big changes that need to happen in the next 30 to 40 years.
How about you, Eric? Where do you hope to see this all lead to, and kind of paint that picture of human health, food, healthcare, and environmental care? How do you see this all coming together in the big picture? Yeah, well,
I totally agree with Stefan. I mean, my big vision is that the healthcare system is really sick care at this point, and a lot of it is tied to the foods and other habits that we have, the foods that we consume and other habits that we have. You know, the Rockefeller Foundation put out an interesting piece last year about the true cost of the food system. And, you know, we spend $2 for every one on repairing damage done relative to what we pay at the checkout aisle. So our food is cheap at the checkout aisle because we haven't internalized all the real cost of that system across the spectrum, right? And if you think about the amount of money in the healthcare system that is around treating symptoms that have many times been caused by metabolic anxiety, I'll call it, Stephan, for lack of a better term, right? My dream is that this all comes together and we can live in a healthier fashion. The money that is spent to create health as opposed to fix things that we've broken up front. And people say, well, you know, you're talking about a very elite food system. It's going to be way more expensive now. You know, I think that is a very reductionist view of the way that things can work here. I think that it's simply a reallocation of what we spend money on. And if the cost of food goes up because we've also solved for other issues through that food production system, and we're not spending that money elsewhere, our net cost of living should go down, right? It's a complicated formula, but if you go through the logic of that, I think it holds water. And so that's my vision, is that, you know, our cost of living goes down because we've reallocated where we spend the money and we get it right this time.
Yeah, and mind you, Eric, if you know, and that is so important about the true cost of food. The true cost of food may not be reflected in our cheap grocery bill, but mind you and I as the consumer will pay for it elsewhere with cleaning up water supplies, cleaning up soils, right, and things like that. So when people say, "Oh, this is an elitist thing," I also, like you, disagree with that, because we still pay for it elsewhere because someone has to pay for it. And we as consumers are the ones that are paying for it. So it's just a sort of reallocation of the cost and a sort of a rewiring of the way that we think about these things.
The other thing I'd like to add to that is not only does the quality of food increase and your overall cost of living decrease when you look at it in macro, I would also contend that quality of life increases. I have both conventional farm and a regenerative farm. Okay. So when we're on our conventional farm growing corn and soybean, if we spray a chemical to kill the weeds, you know, that's standard practice. That's what we do. If I spill some of that on me, I get a little nervous, right? But if I'm moving cattle from pasture to pasture, and let's say she decides that as I'm moving her through the chute that I needed to take a little bath in, you know, some fresh fermented go juice, right? It stinks, but I'm not worried about that killing me. See, so right. I think there's a quality of life aspect that, and I think the elitist thing, that's at first, right? Because there's such a small supply of it, and because there's a small supply, we don't have the processing efficiencies and all those kind of things. But I think as the momentum builds, you agree that cost will come down just because we're wasting so much to create it now. And it won't be as elitist, but you just kind of have to get over that hump, right? And that's essentially what the two of you are doing together.
Yeah. I mean, it's the cost of the system. I agree that always comes down. I mean, I think solar is probably a good example of, you know, what happens to what was considered to be an elitist means of producing electricity. And it too has its issues, right? So it's not like solar has solved everything. But I think in the food case, it is Stephan, you characterized it correctly. It's a rewiring of the way that we think about where our money is spent, right? And because everybody's healthcare is expensive, and because everybody's taxation is high, and you think about where that money goes, it's going to fix things that could be avoided in the first place, right? You can lay this out, and that's work that some people are doing. There's true cost accounting is a theme at this point that many applied economists are working on. To say, in total, we spend way more than we have to, but we just don't tag it correctly. We don't identify that expenditure correctly. So I think that economic proposition, if that's all that motivates people is economics, I don't care. I'm all for it, right? We know what we can do because the science backs it up, and let economics be the driver. That's great, because underlying those economics are a good set of outcomes that today are a little bit elusive for us because we've built the system that we've built. It's not a bad system. It actually works extremely well for what it was designed for, right? So this isn't about pointing fingers at the system, but we do need policy changes to help support these initiatives. The policy elephant in the room still has to be dealt with, but I think we can deal with it more effectively when we have science in our corner.
Excellent. But no, I really want to thank you both for your time. I know you have a lot of things going on. Eric, you've got some very interesting articles, and follow him on LinkedIn. Read a lot of the things that you're doing there. Have to look at the litany of background that this gentleman has. It's amazing. You've done a lot of work in the industry to really move the industry forward. And what the Bionutrient Food Association is doing is amazing. I mean, really the cutting edge things that we really need. And Dr. Van Vliet, definitely follow him. He's at Utah State University now, doing some amazing things there. Really thoughtful and thinking about how we can really get the soil to human health connection working together. And I'm very excited about this area. And thank you both for your contributions and what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Invitation.
All right. Take care and get that figured out. We expect results in about 6 months. That'll be great, Dr. Van Vliet. So no problem.
Eric, I expect some results in 6 months.
A full supply chain rework and these food systems probably in the next 12 months. They should have that done. So,
sure. No problem.
We'll get back together in about 13 months and we'll hear how great everything's working. Okay.
That's great.
I appreciate your dedication to this long-term vision. Thank you so much, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
We hope today's episode has encouraged you to learn more about the opportunities you may have to participate in the value created around production practices and quality. And the great news is that impact goes far beyond your bottom line. And as always, if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing to help growers implement soil health practices, check out our website at asn.farm. And there you can click on links to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. There's a lot of great things happening and always something to learn. Thanks for listening.